The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we're going to do a little bit of a workshop regarding as to how is it that you can write a hypothesis paragraph. As you know, the introduction will always include a paragraph that generally refers to the hypotheses that we can expect, both in the descriptive side of things and also in the experimental side of things. And today I'm not alone. I'm being joined by my research assistant. Of course, he's out of commission for the time being. So you and I can get started. Now, for this study, you and I are going to pretend that we are the researchers. We are the researchers of a study. We are part of a research team. And in this particular sense, this study was focused on the factors that affect an interview rating, the individual being rated favorably or unfavorably regarding a job application. Now, when we are thinking about how we're going to measure this stimuli, we're going to think about the stimuli, for example, of a picture of the job applicant right beside the interview notes. So that is the stimuli that we would present to the research participants. Now, we are going to allow the research participant to provide a rating. Our job as researchers for this scenario is going to write a research report. So we're trying to see whether or not these individuals rate individuals differently that apply for the job based on their physical attractiveness. What are the elements that go into that hypothesis paragraph? So the first thing that we're going to look into is noting where exactly would you place this particular paragraph. So the hypotheses are generally within the third paragraph of the introduction. Notice that, as I noted earlier, one of the things that you would like to do is make sure that you include both the experimental hypotheses and also the descriptive hypotheses. We're also going to cover in detail as to what exactly these type of hypotheses look like. Notice that something you would like to include is the original source. So for example, we're going to end that specific paragraph with a presentation of what exactly was the model of the researcher. So for instance, you would quote what model did they use to interpret said findings after the hypothesis. You will notice that one of the things you would have to include is that of a transition sentence. And what do we mean by that? Whenever you include a transition sentence, I want you to include basically a general statement of the variables that were present in your study. So for the case of illustration, think about, for instance, the variable of personality and the physical attributes that we would believe as researchers, as part of our hypothesis, would contribute to the interview assessment. So you want to include a general statement that presents the variables that are in hand for your study. So for instance, independent variables of personality and physical attributes. So you would note the statements for your independent variables, and then you will note a statement, I should say, for your dependent variable. Notice that you also want to include a justification. You want to include a justification for your experiment. Why is it that we would need to include a statement of justification? Well, in the field of social sciences, particularly that in the field of psychology, one of our main goals is to provide research that can allow us to solve practical problems. Therefore, part of the justification will come and will assist us in providing an explanation as to why we consider that this research had value and therefore their application in real world problems. Now, there are other types of research, for example, basic and applied research. And in regards to basic research, we would still provide a justification. However, it wouldn't be geared towards the addressing of a practical problem. But for the case of this paragraph, you will provide a justification and as to how we would use that justification that provides merit to our research. It is immensely important that you provide a general description of manipulation. It is immensely critical. And why is that? Well, because part of our research involves that we will be able to replicate your study later on. So you do want to include in that hypothesis paragraph, you want to include a description as to what exactly was manipulated and what was measured. So for example, how are we manipulating that independent variable and how are we measuring that dependent variable? Remember that in this scenario, we were looking at the interview notes. We were trying to ascertain whether or not the impacts of coworker rating and attractiveness rating, for example, our dependent variables, were indeed impacted by the influence of that independent variable. The next sentences that you would like to include is stating that experimental hypotheses. And also, you would like to include yet another statement of the descriptive hypotheses. Now, you always want to end the statement with the model that you are utilizing to test such predictions. Now, you may be wondering, what is the difference between an experimental hypothesis and a descriptive hypothesis? So we're going to talk about a little bit what exactly is each one of these different hypotheses that you are to include in your hypotheses paragraph within your introduction. What exactly is an experimental hypothesis? Notice that one of the things that you're going to include in an experimental hypothesis is that of the main effect. Remember that we want to mention what the impact was upon that dependent variable as experienced by that independent variable. So we're looking at the effect from this independent variable towards the dependent variable. So that is what an experimental hypothesis is. Notice that as an illustration, remember that hypotheses are predictions. Hypotheses seek to provide a potential prediction as to what we would expect those effects to be. So, for example, the dependent variable would change, or dependent variable can be impacted by the physical attractiveness of that interviewee. Now, another interesting factor is that in this case, we also had interview notes as yet another independent variable. So in this particular regard, we would list that specific hypothesis based on the impacts of that interview note, i.e., or independent variable, and how exactly is the effect going to change regarding that dependent variable. We would note and mention that there will be a change with the notes that are indeed being influenced regarding personality. Notice that we can also see an interaction. And what is an interaction? If we revert back to the slides, notice that whenever we have our independent variables, sometimes there could be an interaction between independent variable number 1 and dependent variable number 2. So that again can also be a hypothesis. You may have an interaction between independent variable 1 and independent variable 2. Let's consider this possible interaction. Think about independent variable number 1, which is interview notes, and the second independent variable of the face that was presented to set raters. So notice that maybe just the interview notes did not have an effect, or just the face did not have an effect on the ratings. However, there could be an interaction between both of them, and then together they could have an interaction and therefore could have an impact upon our dependent variable. So notice that we are indeed interested in that interaction, and you want to make sure that you list it. So any interaction between those independent variables. So notice that here we would mention something, for example, of the notes, our first independent variable, and face, our second independent variable, and that their interaction together is going to make a change within that dependent variable. You also want to list within your experimental hypotheses what the dependent variables are. And remember, a dependent variable is the one that is going to receive that effect, that is going to be measured. You have coworkers and their rating, and how is it that they rate the physical attractiveness of that individual. Now that you heard me talk about the description of what exactly an experimental hypothesis is, let's look into what exactly a descriptive hypothesis is. In regards to a descriptive hypothesis, we're only looking at the descriptive statistics that we may find within a research. Basically, any form of statistic or presentation that allows me for a description of what exactly did we find. So, for example, we can talk about frequency data. What exactly is frequency data? When we are referring to frequency data, what we refer to is, for example, the amount of an observation within our research. So for instance, it could be the amount of notes, the amount of, for example, rating or favorable or not favorable rating that an individual received. It could also be, for example, the demographic characteristics of your sample, of the individuals that participated in your study. So for example, how many individuals identified as male, how many individuals identified as female, or perhaps non-binary or transgender. So notice that that will be a description of your data, and therefore we call those descriptive statistics. Specifically, in terms of frequency data, is how much or the count of what a particular statistic is within our study. Notice that if we keep with our example of our hypothetical scenario, notice that in regards to this hypothesis, as I mentioned earlier, a hypothesis is a prediction. So think about, for instance, if we have negative interview notes, we're going to have a higher frequency of no higher. Notice that we are doing a prediction. The highest frequency, the more negative notes we have, the higher the no response would be in regards to when we hire an individual. Let's also talk about another form of descriptive hypothesis. And in that particular case, we are looking at correlation, right? We are trying to observe a relationship or a link between two variables. It doesn't necessarily mean that one caused the other. However, we are looking for a link. So think about this. Think about potential relationships between one variable and the second variable. So for example, think about the relationship that you may have with your siblings, right? Although you guys are indeed related and there is a genetic relationship between the two, notice that that doesn't necessarily mean that one caused the other, right? Your parents caused you and brought you into existence. So notice that even though you may have a relationship, it doesn't necessarily mean that one caused the other. However, correlations are so immensely useful when we are conducting research, and you will include them in your description of your hypothesis paragraph. When we are thinking about a correlation, think about the relationship between positive notes and the relationship that they may have in regards to the starting salary. Hopefully, this illustration and this example of what exactly goes into a hypothesis paragraph, and also what exactly are each individual elements of the hypothesis paragraph, can assist you and help you as to how are you going to write that introduction for your research paper. So best luck to you and hope to see you again.